What's your name?
Neil Spring.
Neil Spring. Were you one of the original people to start researching the triangles back in 1983?
I definitely think I was one of the people who first started looking into those triangles that appeared in 1983.
Has it been like an ongoing research?
Yeah, it's something it's something that I've followed over the years, and something I came across when I was doing research for my book, The Watchers, as well, which I'm here discussing tonight, partly in part.
Is this the book here?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay, this is Neil Spring's book, The Watchers, available on Amazon.
Amazon, Waterstones, and all the bookshops. Yeah.
It's brilliant. I look forward to the
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right.
But without them, they got no place. I was always a one guy.
Yeah.
Tonight we have the pleasure of the company of Neil Spring, who's come all the way from London. He's from Swansea, but he's made a special trip tonight to see us. And he's going to give us a talk on the Welsh Triangle, which was has been dubbed in 1977 as a spate of sightings in the Pembrokeshire area. There will be a Q&A at the end, and Neil's brought his book here. Have you brought any other copies?
No. Sorry.
You missed out there, you could have sold it.
They're in Waterstones and online, you can find it.
Well, basically Neil started off when he was in school in Bishopston. He had an interest in UFOs, and he took upon himself to investigate locally the sightings going on at the time. He then went away to university in Oxford, I believe. Yeah.
Yep.
And he started a group called Global.
The group was called Open Minds.
Open Minds, yeah. And he carried on with his work there. He did write 2 cracking articles for UFO magazine in 2001 about a spate of sightings seen on a night in 1998 in the Swansea area. If you managed to get copies of it, it's well worth a read. He then went on to become a novelist. He's written a novel called The Ghost Hunters. That was the first one. Or is it Gary Price?
Harry Price.
Harry Price. Yeah. Ghost Hunter. And latterly The Watchers, which is being adapted for TV, I believe, isn't it? So he's a talented guy with a background in UFOs and a lot of knowledge. So can we put your hand together, give Neil a good welcome.
Right, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let's make sure you can all hear me at the back. Yeah, that's all right. Good. Well, firstly, thank you very much, Emlyn, and to the whole Swansea UFO network for having me here tonight. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here, and I feel very, very welcome. Just in terms of what I'm going to do, I'm going to run you through a talk which I've entitled tonight, Secrets of the Welsh Triangle. But if at any point anyone wants to stop me and ask any questions, please just put up your hand or shout out, whatever's easiest for you. Now, I should begin by saying that I'm not a UFO investigator, I'm not a ufologist, but I am a storyteller. And I have a story to tell you tonight which boils down to 3 main things. UFOs exist. There can be no doubt whatsoever about that. They've been photographed, witnessed by many, investigated by hundreds of governments all over the world. The second thing I'd like you all please to remember tonight is that UFOs have an explanation which goes far and beyond anything to do with military aircraft or secret military planes or anything of that nature. I don't mean that to imply that they're extraterrestrial. Of course, that's a possibility. But UFOs have an explanation which goes far and beyond what the authorities would have you believe. And the third thing I'd like you to please all to remember tonight, and this one is really very important, is that our governments, or agencies within our governments, do not want any of us to know that fact. Now, I'm aware of this information, not because I have a faith, by that I mean a belief without any evidence. I'm aware of this evidence, I'm aware of this information because I hold this belief very strongly based on information that I have been privy to, as I'm sure many of you have also been privy to. And I hold this belief because many people around Swansea and far beyond have spoken to me personally about their experiences. And those experiences informed this book which Emlyn referred to just now, The Watchers, which is a fictional tale based on reported sightings of UFOs in West Wales in 1977. Just out of interest, by show of hands, how many people here are aware of those sightings? Okay, very good. That'll make it a bit easier tonight. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about how I came to this subject, because I just said to you that I'm not a ufologist, and that's not strictly accurate in the sense that, as Emlyn said, in 2001 I was very actively involved in investigating this subject, but I didn't come to it from a position of simply looking out there for information on UFOs. I actually came to it because I was really, really interested in stories, and there were two things that happened that got me interested in the wider stories of UFOs. The first was, my mum's in the room. My mum and I were in a bookshop in St Helens Road, and there was a lady in there who was practicing the art of dowsing over a map when we walked in. I thought, that's very interesting, what are you doing? And she said, oh, I'm trying to find somewhere for us to move our bookshop to. And she said, the crystal's going to tell us where to go. And I said, right. And Mum sort of looked at me as if to say, what? She's going to move her business to go somewhere else based on a crystal. Anyway, I found a spot at the back of the bookshop which was to do with UFOs. And I was flicking through a book, and the lady behind the counter said to me, if you are interested in UFOs, you ought to look at what the kids saw down in Broadhaven in 1977. And I'd never heard of anything happening down in Pembrokeshire in 1977, but it lodged somewhere in my mind. And then separately, I was fortunate enough to have a wonderful teacher in school who she told me about the day that some boys, I grew up in Bishopston, some boys living in Bishopston had seen what they thought was a UFO on the ground. And I said, what do you mean? Just in the middle of the day, just sitting there? And she said to me, they saw a landed object on the ground, and their father, or one of their fathers, was the Reverend Bishopston, and he was very shaken by what his son had seen. Well then, that's the story that hooked me, actually. So I went away and I did some research. I actually went to the library and flicked through newspaper reports. But I also did something else. I went and found the boys today. Well, I found one of them. I found Andrew Everson, who he did live in the Males. And Andrew very kindly welcomed me into his home, and he sat down with me. And the story he told me was this: on a summer's day, and I believe it was 1977, or it might have been a year or two either side of that.
Yeah, it was the last day of the summer holidays.
Right, last day of the summer holidays. Nice nose stuff. Brilliant. Last day of the summer holidays, they lived actually very near to where I lived, which was where Northway Court is now, really, in Bishopston, but the farmer's field was adjacent to the main road. And Andrew and his friend were picking blackberries, and the hill was, you have to imagine, a sort of sloping hill. They were coming down the hill, and they turned and they saw right at the bottom of the field a cigar-shaped object, which was, to use his words, the size of a single-decker bus, with a surface like brushed aluminium and a small dome on top, maybe a flashing light. And he said, we stood there and we looked at this object and we ran. And we ran back, and they told his father, who was initially very, very sceptical, until, of course, they returned to the spot, and what did they find there but a big burn mark. Now, if anyone has seen the original picture in the Evening Post that they took, sure enough, you can see there is a mark. It doesn't look to me like a burn mark, but it looks, there's a mark on the ground, and the two boys are crouching there on it. And I spoke to the farmer who I tracked down, who at that time lived in Merton village, and the farmer confirmed to me that he had absolutely no idea what could have caused this mark, and that he thought there was, I mean, he said he was very sceptical at the time, but he said, I have not been able to explain what they saw. And to him it was still a mystery, and to Andrew Everson it was still a mystery. And one thing that was a mystery to me, which he said and lodged in my mind, was that some men came and asked us some questions. I always remember he said that to me, and he didn't imply they were government men. He talked about going to America. He said there were some people who would come and ask him, but it was all very vague. But I'd just like you to remember that, because it's important for what I'm going to come on to talk to in a little bit. After moving away from Swansea, when I was at university, I became aware of a woman who became a good friend of mine, who I'm afraid is no longer with us, whose name was Georgina Bruni. Georgina Bruni, as many of you will know, wrote a book called You Can't Tell the People. And the origin of that title came from a dinner party that she was attending, at which Margaret Thatcher was sitting next to her. And I'm sure many of you have heard this story. And she got onto the subject of UFOs and the Rendlesham Forest incident. And of course, Margaret Thatcher turned to her and said, UFOs, quote, you must have your facts and you cannot tell the people. Well, afterwards, Georgina and I stayed in touch for some time, and again, as I said, it's a great shame that she died so young. But I do believe that Georgina Bruni's book on the Rendlesham Forest incident is one of the best books you can read on the subject. And I know there's a lot of information that she deliberately left out of that book as well. Again, which I'll come back to a little bit later on. But my interest was ignited from this point on, and was very, very strong. And I have to say, what happened, if you go, it was after meeting Georgina that I began to think, actually, yes, maybe there is some substance in these claims, that the government is actually taking this whole subject more seriously than any of us might suppose. Of course, we all know when the modern wave of flying saucers began, which was in 1947 in the summer, when Kenneth Arnold said he saw his objects which skipped like a saucer would across water. And he told that story to the press with great glee. And then shortly after that, the disc landed in Roswell, New Mexico. I think there can be now no doubt that something came down there which the government were not prepared to admit to at the time, and I'm not sure how many people in the room take seriously any of the government's, the US government's recent explanations for that sighting. They're slightly more credible than the ones they put out at the time, the weather balloon, but I don't think a great deal more credible. And then, of course, the great sightings of 1952 in Washington, DC, which were basically mass sightings, where you had a great number of lights seen over the Capitol building. If my slides were working here, I'd be able to show you these on the slide, the photographs that I had. But what was extremely interesting to me, though, looking back over history over that period, was how our government were looking at the subject. And when I was doing my research for this book, I came across a memo, which is basically a letter which comes from a member of the Air Force, retired. This letter is sent to the Chief of the Air Staff, and it begins, "Dear Sir, in 1952 I was stationed in the Far East with the RAF at a particularly large and important base, and during one fine summer's day, with not a cloud in sight, nor any aircraft about, or balloons or flares, suddenly, and in full view of everyone on the base, we were deliberately buzzed by a large flying disc, which glowed red on the trailing edge as it made several passes over our base, which housed our Vampire and Meteor aircraft." He goes on, "It made a loud buzzing sound as it shot about. The disc was in the area for about 3 minutes before it shot straight up to the zenith at a speed our radar chaps estimated to be about 600 knots. We were told not to write home about it or to talk about it to outsiders, but we were all well aware that we had seen something of great importance, and that governments are aware that these things are not coming from outer space, other galaxies either, but somewhere else, quote, another place." Anyway, he finishes and says, "Can you please tell me who decides in the MOD there is no danger to our defences, and how do you investigate it?" Who indeed? Well, of course, that question as to where these things come from kept being asked, and the same year Winston Churchill sent his famous memo, "What does all this stuff about flying saucers amount to? What can it mean? And what is the truth? Somebody let me have a report," and indeed they did, and we all know, I assume most of you know, that he was basically fobbed off by the MOD. Well then, we're lucky because there were people in the defence establishment who weren't prepared to be fobbed off. And the Admiral of the Fleet is one of those people. Led the Great Battle of Britain at the time, and as we're all aware, went on record with a very, very impressive UFO sighting, and indeed, until the day he died, was assisting Georgina Bruni in looking into the incidents around the Rendlesham Forest of December 1980. That case is one I'm just assuming most of you here are very well aware of. How many of you have heard of the Condign report from the MOD? Yes? So it's worth reflecting that although the MOD were very, very happy to not talk about the December 1980 incident in Rendlesham Forest, where a craft apparently landed in the woods next to the twin air bases RAF Woodbridge and RAF Bentwaters, it's worth noting that the MOD were quite happy to sweep all this under the carpet. But Nick Pope and many other researchers in the field have since spoken to this very insightful document, which was entitled Unidentified Aerial Phenomena in the UK. This is now in the public domain, by the way, and all of you can go and look it up. This declassified report, which was conducted by Britain's Defence Intelligence Staff, concludes that UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, do exist. It concludes that that's indisputable, and that these craft clearly, sorry, it doesn't use the word craft, but and that these phenomena clearly exhibit characteristics that are, quote, well beyond any of those aircraft, any aircraft or missile. Now, what's interesting about this report? There are three things interesting about it. The first is that it's classified UK secret, eyes only. So if there's nothing in the UFO phenomenon, why is our government creating reports entitled on the subject entitled UK Secret Eyes Only? The second interesting thing about it is that there were only 11 copies of it made, which implies that it was a document considered to be of some sensitivity. And the third most important thing about it is that it was conducted by the Defence Intelligence Staff. All of these things have implications, I think, that point to the conclusion I outlined at the beginning, which is that our government take this subject far more seriously than they are willing to admit to on the face of it. And I have to tell you, when I became aware of the sightings in West Wales of 1977, a question at the top of my mind was, how seriously did the military and the government take those sightings? Because those sightings, which occurred throughout the winter of 77 and into the summer, occurred within an extremely sensitive geographical area, militarily speaking. Not only did they occur within close proximity to a missile testing range and to a very secret US naval station positioned on the perimeters of RAF Brawdy overlooking St. Bride's Bay, but they occurred within a pretty populated area. This community would have something to worry about if they thought that there were secret military aircraft being tested and possibly landed in their fields and pasture lands, as many of the witnesses living in that area claim to see. So I was interested to what extent they took those sightings seriously. I'll touch upon one sighting that I suppose if you had to think about the sightings of in West Wales of 1977, you'd think about three particular events. The landing of a UFO at the Broadhaven Primary School, a series of sightings at a place called Ripperston Farm, a few miles away up on the cliffs, and a series of sightings which afflicted a hotelier living at the Haven Fort Hotel in between Broadhaven and Little Haven. Let me just touch upon her for a moment. Her name was Rosa Granville, Spanish in origin, and her daughter's name is Francine. And I believe Francine still lives at the Haven Fort, although Rosa's now dead. One night, Rosa woke up to a rocking sound outside her window. There was the window was rattling. There was a light shining into her room, and she was deathly terrified. So terrified that she got out of bed and she went to the window and she looked out. And what did she see there? A landed object on the ground with figures walking around it. I can't tell you whether she saw one or two figures. I believe it was more than one, but they were silver suited. They were very tall, and they seemed to be inspecting the ground. Now, Rosa Granville reported this sighting to the newspapers and became the subject of some well, a bit of a joke, I suppose, amongst some of the people living in Little Haven. Unfairly, I might add, because she was soon to be vindicated, because there was a whole other flurry of sightings soon to follow. But what was really interesting about her sighting was that after the event, and I know I've heard this firsthand from the witnesses when I visited the area about 10 or 11 years ago, they were visited by some men. And the way this story was put to me, I'll just tell to you now. Francine was sitting in the bar. The bar at the Haven Fort Hotel looks out over a sort of wide gravel drive. And she was in the bar, and they heard the doorbell go. And she said to me that was the first thing that was strange, because whenever a car comes up on the driveway, we hear it come up the driveway, but suddenly there was someone at the door. So she said, we went to the door, and there were two men standing there. She said to me that they had skin that was like a woman's skin, is the word she used. And she said they were very similar looking. They were dressed very smartly, and their car behind them, she said, looked like a silver futuristic car. She said, I'd never seen a car like it. But what was even stranger was that these men then said to her, we've come to talk to you about your UFO sighting, but we can't stop today. We'll come another day. And that was it. And then they left. Now that is deeply strange behaviour, and I'm sure we've all met somebody who is deeply strange. No, we've all met people who are deeply strange, right? These people do exist, they do exist. But I'll tell you something that is even stranger. These reports of strange men who come and ask peculiarly placed questions are found all over the world. All over the world. And you only have to look at the similarities between these reports to draw the conclusion that there's something deeply strange going on. And I don't mean that to imply that these men were some sort of alien or from, government agency. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that these things do happen. Because what happened at the Haven Fort Hotel then happened again at Ripperston Farm. Now Ripperston Farm, as many of you will know, is a very, very remote place. Have you been to Ripperston Farm? I mean, it's right. So it's right out on the cliffs. Really quite a spooky place, I would imagine, if you were to live there in the winter. And at the time, of course, Billy Coombs was the head herdsman, and Pauline Coombs was his wife, and they had a couple of kids, well, twins, brother and sister as well. And of course the affair at the Ripperston Farm began on a dark night. Pauline's driving down the road, down a little lane. Suddenly a globe of light falls from the sky and begins following her car. It becomes even more terrifying when the light spins around and flies directly at the car towards the windscreen. It looks like they're going to hit, and then it goes straight up. By this point, she's absolutely terrified, as you would be. All the kids are terrified. She comes to a halt outside the house. They run inside and grab her husband. He comes to the door just in time to see this globe of light above the car, and it flies away. Now, that sighting, as well as being quite interesting, could be out of a textbook. If you've read any UFO books, it follows a certain pattern. But what's really interesting is that report I referred to earlier on, Project Condign, the one done by the Defence Intelligence Staff, that focuses on the military applications of this sort of phosphorescent phenomena. So they admit that these things are real in this report, and that what she saw and what she was laughed at for seeing doesn't necessarily... Suddenly we have independent confirmation from our government that this sort of phenomena exists, and that it could actually have some sort of military application. Whatever application is, I have no idea. But it's interesting. The second really interesting thing to happen at Ripperston Farm, of course, is that the whole family will witness, or Billy and his wife Pauline at least, will witness to one of these very tall figures which appeared at one of their windows one evening. And of course that was an incident that scared them all to death. But I interviewed Pauline Coombs because I was interested to see how much of what she said then she was still prepared to say. And I have to say that not only was most of what she told me perfectly consistent, but I gleaned further bits of information from her. So for example, she told me that there was a bush next to the window, and she said that it was blackened or damaged after this figure, this glowing silver-suited figure with this blacked-out face, had appeared at the window. She said it was damaged, and she also said that the paint around the window refused to stick properly for a while. And that was interesting, but of course we can't verify that because it happened so long ago. But what was interesting was that the son of the family did report also an encounter with a car, a futuristic looking car, which came to the property after their sighting, and that there were men there, dressed smartly. I don't want to use the word men in black because it carries so many unfortunate connotations now. You know, you can't use that phrase without thinking about Will Smith. But But the point is, these things were reported, and I'd read about them. Like I'm sure you've all read about Men in Black and UFO sightings, but when you hear it from the horse's mouth, it has a very different effect, I think. So I was interested in whether or not any of these sightings which were happening around West Wales had attracted any sort of interest from the government. If you go back and look at what the MOD said at the time, they'll tell you, well, it's pretty clear actually, they were aware of the reports that were going on, but they didn't really claim to have any information on it. They claimed they had, you know, they were very woolly about the whole thing. And in fact, Rosa Granville's local MP wrote trying to get answers, and he got a reply basically saying that there was nothing in all this. I think his name was James Wellbeloved, the person who replied. Anyway, you can go and look it up. But the point is, and it's a quite a significant point, is it was in writing at the time that they had nothing on any of these events. Well, I'll come now to the Broadhaven UFO incident at the school in February. I have with me tonight a statement from one of the witnesses, one of the original witnesses, who's happy for me to read this out, and I will read it out. But just before I do, I went to the school about 10 or 11 years ago and looked through. They have a wonderful scrapbook there at Broadhaven Primary School, and the story I was able to piece together is the one I'm sure you've all heard, that on a drizzly afternoon, I think it was a Friday afternoon, the children came running in and alerted their headmaster, Ralph Llewellyn, to the fact that they had seen at the end of their playing field at a hedge that bordered the stream and looked out to a wider hill behind, that they'd seen what they described as a landed flying saucer, a UFO. It was, in fact, they didn't actually have a full view of it. It was half obscured behind the trees. And actually what was really interesting about looking at their drawings is that this object bears a very striking similarity to the one that was seen in Bishopston, which first ignited my interest. Very, very striking similarity. Of course, the headmaster was deeply, deeply sceptical, but the boys' parents were unprepared to forget the whole thing, and Randall Jones Pugh, who was a local researcher at the time, was very, very quickly made aware and went down to the place where this object seemed to have appeared, and he basically discovered a very, very muddy terrain where it would be very, very difficult to place any sort of machinery. Now, that may or may not be true. I've no doubt that he went there, and I've no doubt it was muddy, because it was raining. The visibility was not good that day, and I spent a lot of time in Broadhaven when I was researching the watchers, and I can tell you that there are many people living there, particularly near the sewerage works in the hill opposite, who will say, I'm afraid what they saw was a sewerage tanker, and they've been watching too much Star Trek, because one of the boys actually drew a figure that has pointy ears. Well, I have to say I don't believe that what they saw was a sewerage tanker. I understand why people say it, but if you look at the spot and if you go there, as I have, it's a very, you know, the hill is pretty steep, but also the sewerage works aren't really completely visible. It seems like a very odd thing to have seen. But what convinces me more than that is that the boys all stand by their story today. Well, at least those of them that I have been able to speak to do. And as far back as 1996, I think they all stuck by their story as well. Well, the interesting thing is, and these sorts of events, obviously we can't go back, we can't check, but what we can do is look at the evidence from the time, which is obviously the most reliable. And the evidence from the time was gathered by Ralph Llewellyn. And I know people who, he's no longer with us, I'm afraid, but I do know people who knew him, who said to me he regretted until the day he died not going out to look when the boys called him. And the reason he regretted it is because he asked them all to draw what they saw. And of course all those drawings tallied. They all drew pretty much the same thing. Yeah, with a few discrepancies, but it's a dome-shaped object, a cigar-shaped object with a dome on top, and maybe a light, maybe not. What's also interesting is that many people living around the school, there's a small road that overlooks it. I did actually speak to a couple of people who implied to me that adults had seen the object as well. Now actually at the time there were some canteen workers who were prepared to say they had seen an object up there that looked very similar to what the boys had reported on a different day, and they also thought this thing was pretty unusual. Now, if this incident had occurred in complete isolation, let's suppose that it had, you might be forgiven. I suppose you might be forgiven for thinking what happened was somebody somewhere was dumping some sewerage. They weren't meant to be doing it. It was maybe illegal. They were quite happy for somebody to go away and invent a UFO story. There's lots of big ifs in there. But it didn't happen in isolation, because people all over Pembrokeshire that summer reported seeing silver objects on the ground. And what's also interesting, or perhaps telling about this, is that these objects were never seen moving. They were seen disappearing in situ, reappearing somewhere else, in another part of a field, which doesn't really sound like a sewerage tanker to me. One of the witnesses was a woman who was university educated and lived very near to Ripperston Farm, and her name was Josephine Hewison. Well, Josephine woke up one morning to look out of her window to see an object that she described was like an upturned jelly mould, and again with a brushed aluminium finish. And she said this object was so big that it completely blocked out a local greenhouse, a greenhouse standing on her property. Well, Josephine stood by. I interviewed Josephine myself when I was researching this book, and she doesn't live in Wales anymore. Stood by it, stood by the story. But when I was most recently doing research for this book, I went back to the Havens and I met a chap who knew her, and he said to me, I'm extremely sceptical about all of this. He said, but bloody hell, she was adamant. She was no changing her mind that she'd seen this, and I can conceive of no reasonable explanation as to why she'd make it up. Why would she make it up? Her neighbours, Pauline and Billy, had been ridiculed because they'd appeared in the press quite a few times. So one of the reasons they were ridiculed is because one of the things they saw was really quite astounding. And this is the story which strains the credulity, I think, of the whole Welsh Triangle enigma. I'm sure many of you know what I'm about to say. It's of course the sighting by Pauline Coombs of an object flying into stacked rocks, which was a rocky outcrop off the shore of St Bride's Bay. What she thought she saw was an object flying into it, a door opening and closing, and a door within the rocks. Now, if you've ever seen a bird on a bright sunny day flying around the rocks, it can look a bit like a silver disc from a distance. But what's interesting is that somebody else also saw this, which was, maybe they saw it. Somebody else also saw this, and somebody else was the hotelier at the Havenport Hotel. Now, that for me also sounds like a bit of a coincidence, but we have to take the testimony at face value. I'll tell you that something. When I was in the Havens, walking around the area around Ripperston Farm and Stacked Rocks, I met a farmer who said to me, I got talking to him about this, and he told me two interesting things. The first was if you don't think there's anything out in Stack Rocks, go and talk to the divers at the diving club. That was the first interesting thing. The second thing was I used to hear that he used to have some people who would stay at his farm because he used to run a bed and breakfast. And he said they would go out walking around Stacked Rocks frequently until one day they came home and they said, "We're never coming back here again." And he said they never spoke about it. Well, I went to the Divers Club and I asked, because my curiosity was piqued. It was a good story, as I said, the stories are what I'm all about really. And I went and spoke to somebody at the Divers Club, and they said that there were members of their club who had seen equipment under the water around Stacked Rocks. So they said they'd seen a ladder embedded in the rocks. Now that seems to me like something you could go and check, and I'm not a diver. I'm just telling you what they told me. But it did make me think, because at the hotel I learned a story which I don't think has been put down in print before, but I used a version of it fictionalised in my novel, and the story basically came from the hotel where the UFO was seen. And the story boiled down to this: there were some people staying there who worked up at RAF Brawdy. Well, they didn't work at RAF Brawdy, they worked at the top secret naval installation next door. It was officially an oceanographic research station. Very, very top secret at the height of the Cold War. And what they were doing, or what they said they were doing at the time at this station, was running and these microphones were basically listening to top secret Russian submarines. And the whole operation was called Project SOSUS, Sound Surveillance. And if you go to the Public Records Office in Kew, you can look through and see all the documents as to how our government agreed to take this station at the time and the effect it was going to have on the local population. They were really, really, really concerned about the effect it would have on the local population. So why weren't they concerned when hundreds of sightings started pouring in of objects which were completely unidentified landing in people's back gardens? Didn't make any sense. Well, we now know the truth. They were extremely concerned because a letter came to light, which some of you may have seen. But this letter basically is sent by an official working at the Ministry of Defence. And it's a letter to the RAF police. And it reads, it's dated 14th of June 1977. And it says, "We've not invoked the assistance of the Provost and Security Services on UFOs before. And as I explained on the telephone, the last thing I want to do is to involve you in problems which would divert you from your more immediate work on low-flying complaints." But he goes on and he says, well, the standard procedure on UFOs is to send reports to the various specialist authorities and the MOD to make sure that they contain no items of defence, and nothing has come to light to suggest anything untoward in Wales. Important point. Then he says, "I confess, however, that I find the correspondence a little puzzling. According to the press cuttings, some of the witnesses are people who might be expected to be fairly level-headed, and the local MP has been inundated with inquiries." He then says, "I should be grateful if you would have a look at these papers and let me know whether you think there may be some need for a discreet inquiry, whether it would be worthwhile, and if your staff could find the time." He then finishes his letter talking about whether or not there is evidence for a more serious specialist inquiry, and finishes I have not committed you in any way, and I have not even told the minister I am consulting you. Well, the minister was the one answering parliamentary questions on this. I think that's actually quite curious. Firstly, because it means, it shows basically that the old adage, ignorance is bliss, rings true. The minister was unable to give the truth because plausible deniability applied. The officials at the MOD hadn't told him. But I understand why they were interested, because as I said, West Wales was a very, very, very vulnerable space at that time. And research released since 1977 has shown that Wales, West Wales in particular, was on the nuclear strike list for the Soviets, and it's not hard to see why. So why did these UFOs, or wherever they come from, choose this part of Wales? Is it because of the work that we were doing there? It's a question that you could legitimately apply to the landing of an unexplained object in Rendlesham Forest in December 1980, because of course those bases weren't just holding nuclear weapons as we know now, but were located in close proximity to top secret radar installations as well, and radar research. And there's a great deal of speculation that I don't want to go into really, but a great deal of speculation about the nature of that research and what it might have had to do with the object they saw in the woods. And you can draw your own conclusions about that. But I did have to ask myself, why is it that these objects disappeared in situ and vanish? And this probably isn't a popular theory amongst people who would like to believe that there are tangible objects visiting us from outer space. But that sort of behaviour, these objects that can sort of slip in and out on radar, implies to me something that's more paranormal in nature than it is nuts and bolts. Having said that, who's to say that a very advanced nuts and bolts craft hasn't perfected the ability to do these things which are beyond our understanding? It's certainly beyond mine. And on that note, what I'd like to do is to open the floor to some questions, because I think I've spoken long enough. Thank you.
Mike has his hand up.
Yes.
About the same time down in Gower, there were some similar sightings of UFOs. Have you looked into that?
Yes, so the same time of 1977.
I was going to say they had speculated it was in Hawaii and they might well have to come over there. And people had seen them on the hill from the school.
Well, I'm aware that there were certainly sightings over Gower, and one of the sightings was the one I referred to earlier about the boys who'd seen something in their field, and whose father was in Bishopston. Another sighting actually occurred to an artist living very, very, very near there, and she, I'm not referring to Mr. Petts, I'm not referring to him. It was another artist who she lived on North Way, actually, on the road there down to Gower, and she was doing the washing up one afternoon, and she said she became aware of an object flying immediately overhead, and she ran out into the garden and she looked up and she said it was a spherical shaped object, again brushed grey aluminium. And she said the phrase which sticks in my mind, and this is a long time ago, but I'm just using the words that she used. She said the underneath of the craft was composed of many shining, radiating filaments, were the word she used, radiating filaments, which made it sound like a very intricate object. And this was very shortly after, or maybe even the same day as Andrew Everson's sighting in Bishopston. There were sightings over Gower much later in 1996, 98. In October 98, almost 21 years later, and those sightings were queried by our then Member of Parliament Martin Caton, who actually put the questions down at my request at the time, and those questions pertain to a series of lights that had been seen over Gower that night, which were pursued by 2 seeking helicopters. One of those helicopters landed at Swansea Airport on the night of the incident, and quite frankly, the details of what happened at Swansea Airport like that are like something out of the X-Files. I'll go into what happened in a minute, but the point is that many people over Gower that night saw something, and the MOD attributed it to a military exercise, essentially, which it could have been. Who knows? But what is interesting is that shortly after the event, I was lucky enough to speak to somebody who worked at the airport, who told me that the objects had been tracked on radar. I didn't see any sort of hard evidence of that, so I can't tell you if that's true. I'm just telling you what I was told. And I was told that the airport that night was visited by a large unmarked car, which was dark and which was parked on the runway without official clearance to be there, and had its headlights switched to full beam, and that one of the helicopters which had been involved in these manoeuvres used that beam to land from the car, to land at the airport that night. Now, I have no idea what was going on, but I've no doubt that it happened, because I was one of the people who saw one of these helicopters and lights myself. So, but many people did. The Coast Guard saw it, and of course, it was all just a military exercise. But I can tell you, at the time, it felt very different to that. But again, it's one of those events which hasn't been explained. Another question.
Governments.
Yes.
If we believe in what we're told, the French government, the South American government, etc., are very open-minded about UFOs. That's what we're led to believe. Would you agree with that, or not?
Which was the other government you mentioned?
South American. I mean, obviously I know there are lots of countries in South America, obviously, but what the point I'm making is, if they're laissez-faire about it, why are the British and possibly the Americans so secretive? You know, what's going on? You would assume that they'd all be singing from the same hymn sheet, or not? You know.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. So, firstly, yes, I would agree that there are many governments who are far more open-minded about it, and the French certainly have had. I think their official investigative group is still ongoing. Actually, I'm not sure if it was ever disbanded, but the Belgians, of course, have been were extremely historically vocal about a series of sightings, the wave of triangular-shaped UFOs that were seen over Belgium on that fateful night. And so much so that they went on bloody national television and showed people the radar tapes. So yes, I would agree that some governments are more open about it. The question of why some governments are not, I think, it basically boils down to what those governments might have to gain. So, and I'm just talking off the top of my head here, but I do believe that it's quite possible that the more developed countries militarily may have more at stake. And I think what I mean by that is there are obviously military learnings that the government and our armed forces can make from this phenomenon. And indeed, that's what Project Condign and it is really well worth a read if you can go and download it from the MOD's website. Is really well worth a look, because it shows that the government has considered learning from this phenomenon to apply to military applications, and I would suggest that's probably why they're probably more secret about it. I'm certainly not proposing that the government has a crashed flying saucer in a hangar somewhere.
No.
But
I was
do,
just interested in your viewpoint.
I also think that the MOD has been quite canny in how they've dealt with this. So the term unidentified flying object has basically been dispensed with, and unidentified aerial phenomena is now common parlance in government, well, certainly in the MOD. But the effect of doing that is actually quite convenient, because if somebody decides to place a Freedom of Information Act request asking for information that our government has on UFOs, basically means they can quite legitimately say, because you didn't ask for unidentified aerial phenomena.
Right.
And how many people in the general public are going to be thinking, oh, I know, unidentified aerial phenomena. It's quite interesting. Hillary Clinton used the term recently in an interview, and made the point that that is the phrase that she's aware of. So she's obviously been briefed on the subject by her campaign manager. But it's certainly, it's a clever way of getting around the subject.
I'd never heard the term until you mentioned it.
Oh, really?
No, I never heard it.
Unidentified aerial phenomena. And the other point worth mentioning is that the way in which the government will investigate reports of this sort of thing is that they will often consult a private contractor who runs our radar systems in the UK. And whereas the government is obliged to give you whatever information you ask for, or at least to consider it, this private contractor isn't. So I do think there is a possibility that the government, although I know people working at the MOD, and I know they have indeed closed down their UFO desk, although that's all well and true, it doesn't mean they're not employing an external agency to continue this work.
Right.
And I wouldn't discount that possibility.
Thank you.
Okay.
Many years ago, when you first started becoming inquisitive, have any strange things happened to you? Because I know I've had numerous accounts of sleep paralysis, strange electronic sounds in the bedroom. I was paid. No, that was me. It's not the batteries out.
You want to take the batteries out there?
I'm just wondering if anything strange has happened since you started all this.
I'm certainly aware of a great many people. So John Keel is a researcher. Read his books. It's really, really good example of somebody who's looked at this phenomenon and encountered many, many, many strange things. I think the problem with these sorts of experiences, I always say to people, there's nobody who wants to see it more than I do, because I write about it. I love everything about these sorts of subjects. That's why I write about them. I've never seen a ghost. I've certainly never seen up close a landed UFO or a flying saucer. I've seen some unexplained lights, but I would imagine many people have. And what I always say is there's nobody who wants to see it more than me, and I've not really, in the same way that Pauline Coombs sees this object, or this the children see this object. I'm not, but I'm greatly envious of people who have, because I think these experiences, actually, as many as they are very special, and they're special because they're rare. That's why they're special. They're so rare, and I would love to see something, but
Danny had his
still wait.
No, I was just listening, kind of forgotten what the question was.
Alright, I got one, will you? Well,
yeah. Okay, first of all, when you say the government, you might have to consider the actual hierarchy. Like we're not 100% sure, without doing quite a lot of research, that the government are necessarily at the top of the hierarchy. So I'd propose the possibility that, depending on the level and the area of government, some people might actually not know what's going on themselves. For example, I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but in the US, the CIA has something 30-something levels, and the president can access something like number 17 or whatever. Like,
It's the need to know thing.
yeah.
Good point.
The point is very well made, because you know, it's quite interesting. Tony Blair specifically requested a briefing on the subject of UFOs. So did Winston Churchill. Before he was elected, David Cameron said he would look into it publicly. He said that. I don't know if he ever did. Hillary Clinton has now said that she will. Bill Clinton at the time claims he did, and Clinton's current campaign manager claims that one of his biggest regrets working for Obama is that he wasn't able to open the files, but that he wants to push this through. Now, are these people saying this because they think it's somehow popular with the electorate, because so many people believe? Well, maybe not, because I don't know how many. I know a great many people working in politics. My partner works in politics, and I can guarantee you, if I was to go out to one of their gatherings and start talking about UFOs, I'd probably get a few laughs. So, and indeed, if you look at the David Cameron answer that he gave, you know, he felt obliged to make a joke of the subject at the time, and the question got a great many laughs. So, but to come back to your point about compartmentalised information, yes, in the United States, that's absolutely the case. There are projects that are yes, but I do think that has the UFO phenomenon been used to manipulate people, and has information about the subject been leaked in a way which is designed to influence people? Absolutely it has. And you only have to look at the way in which the US government and the CIA in particular deliberately used the myth of the UFO phenomenon during the Cold War to test fly their military aircraft, because of course when they were flying the U-2 out of the testing facility in Groom Lake, Nevada, they basically had a ready-made explanation in their hands. If anyone decided to see one of these unpainted objects and report it as a flying disc, that's what it was reported as. It's a flying saucer. Of course, where they overstepped the line, actually quite recently, I think it was last year or maybe the year before, is when the CIA went out on Twitter, I don't know how many of you saw it, and said, remember all those sightings of flying discs back in the 60s and 70s? Quote, that was us. Well, all of the research that's been done plotting the sightings of flying discs over America from the summer of 1947 right up to the pretty much, you know, the 60s, 70s and 80s, all of that work shows that the sightings did not overwhelmingly occur on the flight paths of the U-2 and their other aircraft. So they had an explanation at the time. They're quite willing to use that.
And twisting it round,
and now of course
there's nothing in UFOs. It was just us.
Exactly, and now they're quite happy because what's happened is those sightings continue to this day. Not just sightings of flying discs, but sightings of triangular aircraft. And of course, everyone who's looked into this subject it may be very tempting for people to say, oh yes, sightings of large triangular aircraft began back in the early 1980s. Well, no, they didn't actually. If you go well back, the sightings of these large triangular aircraft with lights at each corner go way, way, way back. This isn't some sort of new phenomenon. The reason it became very public is because of what happened in Belgium. That's why it became so public and really put it on the map. Of course, I suspect the stealth bomber has something to do with it, but I think it probably had nothing to do with what was seen here.
The 1983 case in Swansea, South Wales.
Right, so this is
the triangles there.
I'm just talking about a case which occurred in South Wales in 1983, January 1983, when many people saw, I think what you call the Night of the Triangles. This was when many people saw two very large, well, some of the reports would say they were very large, two very large triangular shaped objects with lights at each corner. over Swansea Valley. Well, these craft, as many of you will probably know, were also seen in Cardiff, all over the Gower. And what was immensely impressive to me when I first became aware of this, because I was actually doing some research at the library through the Evening Post, and I came across, there's a picture I think many of you will have seen already, of the two triangles right next to each other that this lady had sketched in and drawn, and I followed up on that, and I remember somebody wrote to me telling me that they'd been driving along just as you come over the common, on down to Fairwood Common, and they'd seen two very large objects that were sort of pointing towards each other over the road, and she said they were like very high treetop level, and they were really, really low, and there was a sort of humming sound coming from them, and they were lit up like a Christmas tree, or the word she used, lit up like a Christmas tree. Now,
that's another one we haven't heard of.
Oh, see, there we are. I'll go back to my notes, see if
we've got 22 witness references now, so that'll make it 23 though.
22, 23 people from that night.
Yeah. Many of them saw them at the same time in different parts of Swansea.
Yeah.
Is that the same one?
Busy night.
Sign in Brighton Road?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what was really interesting about these reports is that they were, you know, everyone described seeing these very large triangular objects, and they continue to be seen. And of course today we live in a world where any one of us can go down the shop if we want and buy a sophisticated drone, and we all know they make a sort of humming sound and we can fly them around. And now the question in my mind is, did they have that sort of technology back then? Well, I'm sure they weren't selling it over the counter, because I think I would have wanted to buy one if they had at that time. But the question is, did the military have that technology? I mean, we certainly had stealth bombers and all of that, but so that's an interesting question, because I think it would be churlish for anyone to just say, right, what people saw that night was a drone and that's it, and you know. But I also think it would be churlish just to discount the idea, because I've always thought to myself, why would you fly a top secret aircraft over a heavily built up area like Swansea?
Lit up like a Christmas tree.
Lit up like a Christmas tree. Unless that's exactly what you want to do. And what I mean by that is, most drones are used to gather information about people living in built up areas. So, you know, you go out, so they use them in the desert, they use it to listen onto people, to target people. And if that is your objective, if that's what you want to do, then probably yes, the first thing you would do is fly it over a built up area, if you were certain that it wouldn't be unsafe. So I'm not one of these people who says, you know, what was seen that night had to have been something that's necessarily unexplained. It might well be that we can explain it, but I would say this: of the witnesses I spoke to, and you've obviously got, you've done a wonderful piece of work here. You've found so many people who saw it. Many of them do speak about something very big, and certainly the witnesses I spoke to spoke about something very big, and two of them as well. And I find that more difficult. I find that more difficult, because if there's one thing we know about drones is, you know, they tend to be...
Yeah. Well, one of them saw three.
Three?
A huge one, like a jet plane size.
and two
just
smaller
after
ones.
that went, then they saw the two smaller ones.
We saw the reflection in the water, wasn't it?
Oh no, it was a different one.
Oh, right, okay.
Different year that was.
Right.
But either way, you know, I stand by what I said at the beginning, which is that, are these things real? Absolutely yes. And do our government know about them? Absolutely yes. And do they want to keep them secret from us? I think yes.
It's a very good book called To Ride a Pale Horse by Bill Cooper, that covers a lot of this stuff.
Right.
And about the CIA you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, yeah.
Just for people to know.
What's it called again?
To Ride a Pale Horse.
To Ride a Pale Horse.
He's one of the very first conspiracy researchers. He put David Icke in the path. And,
yeah.
you know, to a point anyway. And Jordan Maxwell and
yeah, right.
And all those people in America. You know.
I'll look it up. I just realised that I said to you earlier that I had statement I'd read you. If you'd like to hear it, I'll happily read you. This is a statement sent by one of the original witnesses to the Haven UFO sighting. And this is from a chap whose name is David Davis. He says, on the 4th of February 1977, a damp, miserable day, Haven School in Pembrokeshire received a visitation that today, 38 years later, still remains unexplained. The object was pearlescent silvery grey, approximately 40 feet long, torpedo cigar-shaped with an upper dome section that covered the central third of the vehicle and which was topped with a red pulsating light. I was the last of a dozen or so children to see the object on that day, and although my particular sighting only lasted just a few seconds, what I saw that day imprinted itself on my memory like a photograph. I have never, in the last 38 years, exaggerated or sensationalised the account of what I saw, and never suggested that what we saw was of extraterrestrial origin, and the truth of the matter is that, despite years of extensive research, I am still not really any closer to a satisfactory explanation for what we saw. Many suggestions have been made that what we saw was either an agricultural vehicle or an aircraft from nearby RAF Brawdy. I'd like to state categorically that this is not the case, as the majority of the children at the school, myself included, came from farming backgrounds and would have been able to identify any agricultural vehicle, and because of Brawdy's proximity, we were also familiar with almost every RAF aircraft in the skies. It was also independently verified that no vehicle was at the location of the sighting on that day, and that because of the boggy ground it was impossible for any vehicle to be there. Our sighting was not the last visit to the school, though, and unbeknown to the children and most of the small community, the craft returned a few days later and was on this occasion seen by a teacher and 3 of the canteen staff. Finally, I'd just like to add that we witnesses, myself included, myself especially as the most vocal, have had to endure 38 years of accusations or lying, and some of the most horrific bullying imaginable. Yet throughout all that I have stuck steadfastly to the account I gave right from the start, and I shall continue to do so until my last breath, or until this matter is solved once and for all. Signed, David Davis. When I asked Mr. Davis about any potential MOD interest, he said, there were certainly MOD staff from RAF Brawdy who came to ask us a few questions. Although I'm unsure as to whether this was part of an official inquiry or not, and may have been just down to professional curiosity. Perhaps we'll never know, but I think it's the prerogative for everybody to make their own minds up.
When did you contact him?
That was in October last year.
Oh, last year, very recently.
Yeah. Yeah. So
we had. I've heard of David L. Richards. He wrote the book UFO Wales.
I have, yeah.
He contacted David Davis in about 2011.
Ah.
And he more or less said the same thing. So he didn't read out a statement or anything like that. He just David gave us a talk last year about it. And,
oh, right. Well, if you want to read more of what he said, he did that because when this book came out, this is my novel, The Watchers. When this came out in October last year, we were contacted by a journalist, and actually what happened is that David spoke to the press. So if you go online, you can Google Haven UFO Google News, and you'll see that full article, and you'll see there's more. He says more about it there as well. But it's well worth a look. It's quite interesting.
Steve, you had your hand up, didn't you?
Yeah, having researched it for many years.
Sorry, could you say it a bit louder so everybody can hear it?
Having researched the subject for many years, there seems to be, from my point of view, there seems to be always a paranormal element to the phenomena. So much so that the old hypothesis of nuts and bolts seems to be falling away. It seems to be coming into line with the Nick Bostrom idea of a kind of simulation hypothesis, where we're kind of living in a matrix. That's had a lot of traction in the last month or so, with Elon Musk come out and said we're probably living in a matrix. Bearing that in mind, what do you think is going on? What do you think? I know it's a massive question.
That's the big question.
But what do you think is
Did you all hear that? Could you hear that at the back?
It's a good question. So what do I think is going on, given the many...
And I just add, because I don't think the powers that be, or the powers that think they be, have any idea what's going on. And I think that's why there seems to be a drip feed of disclosure, but I think they won't disclose because they don't know what the hell's going on, really.
Okay, it's a good question, and Steve, I think that if you go back through all of the official documents on this, it's really quite clear that there's a huge amount of confusion in government on this, and there's also a huge unwillingness for people to demonstrate an interest, even if they are interested, because they're afraid of ridicule. But I do agree that if you were to, there are two parts to this. So if you accept, as I do, that many of these sightings have this sort of undercurrent of paranormal phenomena going on, it makes it even more difficult for people to talk about it, because although people can get their heads around the craft from outer space maybe visiting us, the truth of the matter is, if you talk to a witness of a UFO, especially a witness to a close encounter, you'll quickly discover a number of things. You'll quickly discover that person has perhaps seen a ghost in their time, or believes they've seen an apparition. You'll quickly discover they have a sensitivity to electricity, that they may have seen globes of light around their home or nearby, that they may have woken in the night to sense a presence in the room, perhaps or perhaps not paralysed or suffering from sleep paralysis. But these things coalesce, and I think it would be churlish of us to discount the possibility that there are simply some people who are capable of seeing things that other people are not capable of seeing.
I think that's right.
Yeah, Steve and I've we've come to that conclusion as well, because we've interviewed a few people now who say they display they've got a certain amount of psychic ability, and they do sense other things, and they've seen UFOs. It is a common theme, and the other thing I've detected is this association with electricity. So people who are electrically hypersensitive, or who tend to be, sometimes, not always, but sometimes living close to electrical pylons or things like that. But there's a connection here that I don't profess to be able to understand or explain. But I do think, and I'll give you an example. There was a case, you may have seen it in your files, but there was going back to the 1990s, probably the late 1990s, there was a lady that I met who had seen what she described as an object hovering over, this was in Pentrequeith, hovering over the house opposite. And she woke in the night, a bit like the hotelier. Oh yeah.
And she saw this, what she described as a Michelin man hovering over the roof, which sounds absolutely absurd, right, on the face of it. And she said it left a patch where this thing had been, and I looked at where I went and had a look, and it looked to me like a sort of patch that had been left because of the chimney above. There was some sort of, I don't know. But what I do know is that after she told me about this sighting, I quickly learned that she'd had other sightings of strange things and this interest in psychic phenomena. And I absolutely do not believe that we're dealing with people here who have overactive imaginations or anything like that. I genuinely don't believe that, and I understand why people who are not familiar with the subject might leap upon that and say that's the case. And I understand they might say that because basically when you're talking about evidence, you've basically got four sorts of evidence. You've got eyewitness testimony, you've got photographic testimony, you've got physical traces, evidence, and then finally you've got the weight of all the evidence to the contrary that says none of this has happened to me. And therefore, when you weigh it all up, to those people who haven't experienced it, that has a powerful difference. But I would contend that when you take the evidence from our own experience, and when you take the evidence from photographic work, or when you take the evidence from ground traces, radiation marks, and you bring it all together, that evidence outweighs what they would say has never happened. And I think that is steadily the conclusion that governments who have studied this and commissioned top secret studies of it are coming to. And so I think there will be a day when people think, oh, I remember when we laughed about all these people who saw those things, you know, and we'll simply understand it. But I think we're at a stage where we don't understand it just yet.
The thing is, I think you go into quantum physics and stuff, you know, for a lot of it, aren't you? Because a lot of people, when they think of flying saucers, they think of them travelling distances, but really a lot of it is interdimensional, where it's like when you talk about spirits and ghosts, to some people they just look at you stupid, but if you actually break the universe down into frequencies, which is what it is, these are just consciousness or entities that are vibrating at a different frequency, and they occasionally come into our...
Yeah, and it's a compelling theory, right? Because scientists are now saying that you are able to influence, that at a quantum level you are able to influence something happening somewhere else without even touching it. Oh, hang on, what? It sounds like something out of a science fiction film, but you know, suddenly they're saying it. So what's possible today, or so what's impossible today, can sometimes suddenly become possible. And that's why I think when you're studying this subject, it's a prudent thing not to just rush to conclusions. They've got to be this, they've got to be that. The truth is, we don't know. And if there's anyone, you know, even our governments don't know. I think they generally don't know. And if they don't know, how are we going to know? But I understand.
Can I take you back to Ribbleston Farm?
His cows were always getting out. Were used. But then other people said to me, people laughed about all that. You know. Shouldn't have laughed, you know. People in the area. What's really interesting about all the people who live near Ribbleston Farm, even to this day, is that they're really open-minded about it. So they're all. It was odd, but when I was finishing the book and I was staying, and I hired a little cottage, and I went there and I was working on it, and I spoke to some people, and. They were telling me about how they'd seen it. The Haven Fort Hotel on the cliffs was supposed to be haunted by a white lady, and I said, "Oh, what do you think of this story about the white lady?" And you know, there were a couple of people laughing in the bar, and there was a chap sort of hunched over his beer in the corner. I can see he was earwigging, and after they went away, you know, he called me over and he said to me, "You're interested in all these stories about UFOs?" And he said, "Yeah. I've got a story to tell you." And he starts telling me about his own sighting. And what was interesting to me was that this small community was quite happy to laugh about the white lady on the cliffs that someone might not have seen, but in the next breath they're going to sit down and tell you all about their UFO sighting. And I think, you know, there were a great many people there who have seen things. I actually bumped into a woman who said to me she just moved there. She was walking her dogs, and she said to me she had absolutely no idea that this place was a UFO hotspot. And I told her this, and her mouth, you should have seen her mouth drop, because she said to me, "You're kidding me." She said, I saw something a few nights back." She said, "There were these two lights in the sky, and they were dancing around together." She said, "I saw something." She said, "No, I never knew this was a UFO." She said, "I'm going to go and look it up." And this was a woman I met walking her dogs. And I kid you not, and it was down Marine Road near the Broadhaven Primary School where I met this woman. So, yeah, it never ceases to amaze me, Steve.
In your research as well, was there anything about the landscape or about the geographical